As you know, I'm interested in identity politics, and I live in the West, where Westerners are white, and there is this thing called white identity politics. I hesitated and decided not to put it in the title in case somebody might think it racist. So I didn't, but those of you who subscribe to my channel will know the kind of thing I'm interested in, and I am interested in identity politics. And so what I'm going to do is read the first part of the trilogy of essays by Greg Johnson. So the first one is kinship. I don't know at this stage what the other two are. This is obviously something for us to look forward to. He begins, when you look at human history, identity politics is not the exception, it is the norm. History is the story of us and them, tribes, city-states, and nations, trading with and fighting against one another. If you look at the members of any of these groups, you will find that they are united by ties of kinship, a common language and culture, a common history, and a sense of destiny, and bonds of fellow feeling. Now, guess what word is missing here? You know me, and you will know that I talk quite a lot about religion, and what I say is that there'll always be groups of people and they will divide themselves. They will keep dividing and dividing. It's like splitting the atom until you get to one person who doesn't agree with himself from one time of his life to another time of his life. And we've all been there before, haven't we, when our young self would not agree with our older, wiser self. And really, it is the question of deciding who is to decide what we are to do and how we are to live, and whose authority we will accept. So will white people accept the authority of Greg Johnson, or will they accept the authority of well, that is the thing, isn't it, of the Abrahamic God? And those who support Greg Johnson will start bridling at the idea of obeying the laws of the Jewish God. We know Greg Johnson is an atheist, but in rejecting religion as a tool of unity for his people, is he being wise or foolish? Let us read on. He continues, of course, all other groups have these traits as well, but those people belong to different kinship groups. They are bound by different languages and customs. They have different histories and destinies. Moreover, their bonds of fellow feeling don't extend to their neighbours, who might well be enemies. The power of the state can touch every aspect of life. Thus, anything can become the topic of political debate. Political debates can appeal to many kinds of arguments: moral, religious, scientific, historical, etc. Identity politics happens whenever the final argument for or against a political proposal comes down to, this is who we are. This is a statement of identity. We want this law, this institution, this custom, because it fits who we are, and a political order should fit the people who live under it as comfortably and flatteringly as a well-tailored suit. So, who are we? And how should we live? As we know, every nation is a nation state. And a nation state is a defined piece of territory with people in it who are citizens of that nation. Of course, who should be allowed to join the club is something of constant controversy. We know there are problems in Israel when, who is a Jew is a question that is hotly debated. So too in Gentiles are ideas of who belongs to which group, who should be allowed to join, and these ultimately boil down to who is entitled to obtain citizenship and how easily or how difficult it should be to obtain a passport to a particular country. There are certain countries that are considered to be harder to get into than others. For example, Japan. I'm sure it is in fact possible to gain Japanese citizenship or Chinese citizenship, but the rules, as far as I know, are not clear. People think it will be harder to become a Japanese citizen or a Chinese citizen than it is to become a citizen of a Western nation. I think this is to do with how democracy is practiced. It is a well-known way of attracting loyal supporters for your party if you bribe them with passports. So in Britain, we know that Asians who were brought in by Labour regarded as their duty to vote Labour because it was the Labour Party that brought them in. But once they become comfortable, they'll start thinking of voting Conservative or even joining UKIP. So identity is really a matter of subjective perception, because if enough people feel sufficiently aggrieved about some issue or other, then they will be forming themselves into that group and forming their own particular identity. Now, it is considered a white people thing to be concerned about immigration, but in fact, there are many non-white people in Western countries who are concerned about immigration, but who are told to shut up. This has happened to me, and I've seen it happen to other people. It is only natural that when you come to live in a country, you become accustomed to its usual way of doing things. And when you get a great influx of different people from different countries, you are also bound to get concerned and agitated, whatever the colour of your skin. Except for in the West, Western governments have a way of dealing with people who complain about immigration. If they are white, they will be told they are Nazi, fascist, racists, and if they are non-white, they will be told that they will be reminded that they are immigrants and therefore not allowed to complain about other immigrants. This is how the government shuts us up, whatever our race, from complaining about immigration. In this paragraph, Greg Johnson talks about religion, and he talks about a group of people saying, this is who we are, the statement of identity. Now, identity is fluid. We don't need to worry about our identity if we're the only one in the universe. But the moment you introduce a second person, it suddenly becomes important to know the identity of the other person in order to decide whether they are friend or foe. And then when you introduce a third person, issues of names will become important, because one person needs to be able to distinguish between the two individuals that he has to deal with. So while you might be on your own in the universe, you wouldn't even think of calling yourself anything until a second person and a third person turned up. What are you to call that person? When you address him, when you want to call him to you. These become possibly quite fraught matters to be decided with some difficulty, perhaps, at the beginning. He continues, when we appeal to abstract principles and objective facts, they are supposed to be true for all of us. But appeals to identity are true for some people, but not for others. They are particular, not universal. The politics of identity is also the politics of difference, for our identity is precisely what differentiates us from others. Yes, we undergo changes of identity in one lifetime. We are born as infants and we become toddlers, we become children and teenagers and adults, and we are male or female, and we may marry or we may not, we may be gay, we may not. So there are many different choices of identity that we as individuals, even in our homogeneous racial group, could enter into. And therefore, identity is fluid. When we appeal to abstract principles and objective facts, I'm sorry, I've just read that. The opposite of identity politics is universalism, which upholds the idea of a single one-size-fits-all political order based on universally true principles. Universalists claim that identity politics is dangerous because different groups can never reach agreement on political matters if we allow what makes us different to be a final argument. And if different groups can't agree about passionately polarizing political issues, then the only recourse that remains is to fight. Yes? Well, I can't quarrel with that. Oh, but he's disagreeing. This argument fails for two main reasons, he says. First, agreement versus conflict is a false alternative, since two parties can simply agree to disagree. But agreeing to disagree only works if the different parties really don't care all that much about the issue that divides them. If they care a great deal, however, then they can't agree to disagree, since only one position can actually prevail. For instance, abortion is either legal or illegal, which means that the only alternative to fighting is for one side to bow to the will of the other. But this brings us to the second problem in the universalist argument. Abortion cannot be both legal and illegal in the same state, but it can be both legal in one state and illegal in another. In short, there is an alternative to fighting when two groups have passionate and irreconcilable differences about political issues. They can go their separate ways. Abortion is a single political issue, but people feel passionate enough about it to shed blood. The clashes between different peoples are far more complex, involving language, religion, culture, whole ways of life. Thus, their potential for depolarization and explosive violence is far greater, as is the need for political separation. This is why I argue that ethno-nationalism is the best system for handling the politics of identity, says Greg Johnson. Ethno-nationalism upholds the right of all peoples to sovereign homelands if they feel their identities are threatened in multicultural and multiracial societies. Well, it's easier said than done about separation. And for this reason, I think it's unrealistic. Greg Johnson never mentions partition in India. There was a lot of argument and bloodshed about who is to go and who is to stay. And that will be the most awkward and ignored aspect of those who advocate a peaceful parting. I don't think he's ever addressed it, or anyone else has. It's just really a pie in the sky idea. Unless there's some rule, and what rule are you going to make? Who decides who is to go and who's to stay? And it'll, in the end, turn out to be a pogrom, and this is going to alarm and distress a lot of people. Why do people like Greg Johnson want this separation? It is obviously because they find the behavior of people not of their race and not of their nation intolerable. The simple solution, in my view, is to make them behave themselves. And therefore, this is just a law and order problem. I suspect there will be questions of race mixing. Plenty of minorities have come to the West and managed to keep their identity. Jews, for example, keep their identity because they know that they're only supposed to marry each other and not marry Gentiles. It's similar with, people of different races, of a shade, much darker than the white people around them. There will be difficulties about marrying each other, although there will always be inevitably some intermarriage. But if you have a religion, it makes things simpler. You marry somebody who shares your religion. And this is what Jews do. They come in 4 colors, but they're only allowed to marry other Jews. So they may have perhaps some difficulty marrying a Jew of a different tradition. There'll be problems between Orthodox and Reform Jews. And Jews also come from different countries and different traditions and will have different languages. So that might also be difficult. But the point is that they have this religion that unites them. And this is what gives them their identity, which people like Greg Johnson, being atheists, do not have. So when they complain about white genocide, it is really a self-imposed kind of genocide, in that, if you want to call it genocide, it's you're not making enough babies. And I think this is a problem of feminism rather than a problem of immigration, even, because if you had a strong religion, then you would say, we'll never marry people looking like that. And if you had paternal and parental authority, you would be able to make sure that your people looking a certain way will never marry people of another group looking obviously different to your group. But Greg Johnson is gay, and his followers, his supporters, tend not to be married fathers in charge of their family or in charge of their country. And that is really the problem with Westerners who complain about immigration and have, shall we say, female trouble. They have trouble acquiring a wife, and they have trouble staying married to her. And this means that any children that they have will suffer social disadvantages as a result of not being properly parented by but they're two biological married parents living together in a loving relationship. But then Greg Johnson's identity is also a problem because we know he is gay and he is atheist, and this would be controversial in a socially conservative society of the kind that many white nationalists are wistful about. Note that a right is an option, not an obligation. If a person is content in a multicultural society, it is not obligated to break away, but if it chooses to exercise its right, then heaven and earth have no right to stop them. Multicultural societies are, however, prone to conflict around issues of identity. There are two ways to handle these conflicts. First, in order to decrease social frictions, different peoples can simply cease caring about the things that separate them. This, however, only works if their differences are trivial to begin with. But what if they differ on important matters? Such as? He doesn't say. This brings us to the second option, to fight. When fighting about important differences starts, there are only two ways to end such conflicts permanently: the utter destruction of one group, or political separation and the creation of new sovereign states. Separation is the best option because it ends the violence and erosion of identities endemic to multicultural societies, giving all parties the chance to flourish in their own homelands where "this is who we are" can go unchallenged. Of course, who we are is not always good. Sometimes aspects of identity are bad. People cling to alcoholism, imperialism, and the worst sorts of superstition because of appeals to identity. Some peoples are afflicted with genetic disorders that they should not want to afflict on their posterity. Every people can be improved. Moreover, it is entirely natural, normal, and right for peoples to want to improve themselves, to hand on a better society and better genes to future generations. But Greg doesn't mention marriage, which is eugenic, and illegitimacy, which is dysgenic. He continues. Ethno-nationalism, however, lets different peoples work out their own problems. We reject progressive and paternalistic arguments for ruling over other peoples. "This is who we are" always trumps "it's for your own good," even if it really is for their own good, since the greater good is to create peace between different peoples and let them wrestle with their own demons. Separating hostile peoples can be accomplished through moving borders and moving people. In practice, it usually involves some combination of the two. Separation can be accomplished peacefully, as in the Velvet Divorce between the Czechs and the Slovaks, or through terror and violence, as in the breakup of Yugoslavia. The results are the same, but the violent path is far more costly. Since the goal of ethno-nationalism is creating peace between different peoples, we naturally prefer to achieve it by peaceful means as well. It has been known since ancient times that the tripod is the most stable foundation. Identity politics rests on an unwobbling tripod: three facts about human nature that make identity politics inevitable and ethno-nationalism preferable: kinship, culture, and love of one's own. Greg Johnson forgets that this kinship and culture has resulted in, well, the American Civil War, the First World War, the Second World War, the European wars of religion. So you can see that even having the same religion and being the same race is not necessarily going to be a guarantee of peaceful coexistence. So whenever white nationalists talk about kinship and culture and religion, they don't seem to be aware of their own history. Kinship. Greg Johnson continues, the first pillar of identity politics is kinship. In connecting kinship and identity politics, I follow the arguments of J. Philippe Rushton and Frank Salter. Politics aims at living well together in society. The more amicable, cooperative, and trustworthy the people are, the more harmonious the society. The more willing the people are to come together and make sacrifices for the common good, especially in times of disaster and war, the more likely the society is to survive and bounce back. The root of pro-social behavior is empathy, meaning the ability to see oneself in others. The expression of pro-social empathy is altruism, meaning treating the interests of others as equal or even more important than one's own. I'm going to refer to empathy and altruism simply as pro-social virtues. The result of pro-social virtues is social harmony and well-being. Well, these pro-social virtues come from moral principles that come from having a religion that supports marriage and family values. He continues, there's a strong correlation between kinship and pro-social behaviors, ranging from fellow feeling and the willingness to sacrifice one's interests and even one's life for the common good. But the connection between kinship and pro-social virtues is problematic. Kinship, after all, means sharing the same genes. Genes, however, are notoriously selfish. They aim at their propagation into the next generation. Since individual organisms are the carriers of genes, wouldn't individuals be selfish as well? However, how then is altruism anything other than a biological disadvantage, a kind of handicap or morbidity? The answer is that the individual is not the only carrier of his genes. His genes are also present in other people. The closer the kinship, the more genes we have in common. The closer the kinship, the greater the empathy, for we can literally see more of ourselves in our kin. Thus, we would expect more altruistic behavior directed towards closer kin. This is why, from a selfish gene's point of view, it makes more sense for an individual to die for his family and his tribe, since they contain more of his selfish genes than he does. Thus, we would expect greater social harmony and well-being in societies that are more genetically homogeneous, and less harmony and well-being in more genetically diverse societies. This fact alone refutes a modern dogma that genetic diversity strengthens societies. Well, it depends on how well they fight invaders. And I think that really depends on the military organization of the nation state involved. And it is to be questioned what the Americans think they are doing when they allow gay men in the army and transgender people in the army. What is that going to do to military morale? Why isn't Greg Johnson more concerned about that than wondering what civilians are doing? If he's worried about people invading his country, then, well, it's a matter for the military, isn't it? Or the police, and how they are organized and what rules they follow, rather than individuals living in his neighborhood, well, not being particularly expected to police the neighborhood or militarily defend the territory from invaders. He continues, thus we would expect greater social harmony and well-being in societies that are more genetically homogeneous, and less harmony and well-being in more genetically diverse societies. This fact alone refutes the modern dogma that genetic diversity strengthens societies. Until the 20th century, it was universally acknowledged that kinship is the foundation of politics. The very concepts of nation and ethnicity are etymologically derived from concepts for kinship. Even today, the primary way that people become citizens of any political order is of being born that way, meaning that they are kin to those who are already citizens. Even globalists acknowledge the importance of kinship by declaring that all men are brothers. Therefore, we should have no borders and no countries, just a global market and a global state, because common blood trumps everything that sets us apart. Well, anyone who knows the story of Abel and Cain will know that we are quite capable of killing our siblings for reasons of sibling rivalry. And we also know that if we are murdered, we are more likely to be murdered by somebody we know. And it is usually by somebody we have had sex with, i.e., our spouse. Let us continue. But not all men are brothers. Your brother has the same parents as you do, which means that you both arise from the same set of genes, although mixed in different ways, unless, of course, you are an identical twin brother, in which case you have the exact same genes. So not all men are brothers, but as far as we know, all human beings descend from common pre-human ancestors. Thus we are all more or less distant cousins, but the distances between the great continental races and sub-races, whites, blacks, Asians, Amerindians, and non-European Caucasians, Australoids, and Capoids are significant enough that radically different forms of society suit them, which means that societies with multiple races suffer from conflicts that do not afflict racially homogeneous societies. It is just so annoying when you think, it's like, oh, what about the Russian Revolution? What about the Communist Revolution in China? Bad things happen in racially homogeneous societies. What about the English Civil War and the American Civil War? He's just behaving as if he hasn't heard of them. And I suppose his readers also seem to have conveniently forgotten that it is the white man who is infamous for his 2 world wars and his European wars of religion. He has the most schismatic religion. Whatever you think of the Asians and the Chinese and the Africans, I don't think they had a continent-wide war of religion. So perhaps the reason why Western man became For a while, the supreme imperialist was because his religion made him fight everyone else. It made him good at war. To continue, this is why some globalists declare that we will have a stable global society only when all racial and cultural differences have been erased. In short, some globalists are ethno-nationalists. They believe in the one people, one nation principles. Thus, to construct a single world state, they wish to construct a single mongrelized humanity. So much for diversity. Ethno-nationalists also believe in one people, one state, at least one state per people. But instead of destroying all existing peoples to create a world state, we wish to preserve all of them by giving them their own sovereign ethno-states. Does this imply that the natural political unit is the racial state, i.e., whites in one state, all Asians in another? And what do we make of mixed race people? Note that I said that the first pillar of identity politics is kinship. I did not say it is race. Race alone is not a sufficient foundation for several reasons. First, even within races, there are different degrees of relatedness. Genetic diversity, even within a race, may weaken the unity of a society and lead to conflict or the erosion of genetic differences, which are valuable and should be preserved. Why are genetic differences valuable and why should they be preserved? Note that I have said nothing of cultural diversity within the same race. Culture is a second pillar of identity politics, which we will discuss later. Second, even societies in which most individuals are of a typical mixed race type, such as countries in Latin America, the Caribbean, or Southeast Asia, still have an interest in propagating their genes into the future. They are still improved by greater homogeneity and undermined by greater diversity. Race mixing in the past is never an argument for increasing diversity in the present. In fact, one reason that race mixing took place in the past is to overcome the problems of diversity, i.e., of multiple races living in the same society. Is it? I don't think people were encouraged or not encouraged to race mix. I think people marry each other because, well, either they've fallen in love or they can't find anyone else to marry them but that other person that is not of their race. What then is the political utility of the concept of race? Race is first and foremost a biological category. How does it become a political category? First, race is politically important because people don't stay in the same place. They migrate to new lands and intermarry with foreigners. Thus the question arises, what are the outer boundaries of assimilability, beyond which foreigners are not good candidates for becoming part of one society? Race is clearly the outer boundary of assimilability. Thus it made sense for the American founders to limit naturalization to white persons. Being white is not a sufficient condition for being American or German, but it should be a necessary condition. Of course, if a society truly values homogeneity, then mere race is far too expensive a criterion for naturalization, since within the same race there is a great deal of genetic diversity. Beyond that, linguistic, cultural, and religious homogeneity also promote social harmony. Second, race becomes a political category when Europeans find themselves facing common enemies of other races. When an Irishman and an Englishman spend time together, they tend to focus on their differences, but when they live alongside members of other races, they tend to notice their similarities, especially when there are racial conflicts. Third, race becomes a political category when Europeans appeal to their common race, as well as deep cultural commonalities to mediate and mitigate disputes amongst them. White nationalists are fond of the phrase, our race is our nation, but this is not literally true. The white race is not a people because peoplehood is more than just kinship, which brings us to the second pillar of white identity politics, culture. And so that would be part 2, and I don't quite know what part 3 is. It might be religion, who knows? But anyway, culture is a product of law and practice. So eventually we will be going to religion, and I imagine that will be the third pillar of Greg Johnson's 3 pillars of white identity politics.